Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on Tools for Municipal Adaptation Action, hosted by the Prairies Regional Adaptation Collaborative, or PRAC. My name is Joellen Perry, and I'm the Adaptation Lead at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, which serves as the Secretariat for the PRAC. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with the Prairies Regional Adaptation Collaborative, it is an initiative that aims to increase the capacity of government, civil society, decision makers on the prairies to understand, prepare for, and take action to address the implications of our changing climate. Through peer-to-peer learning opportunities and the development and dissemination of tailored knowledge products, we're working to build a network of engaged adaptation practitioners located across the prairies. The collaborative is a cost-shared program of the governments of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, as well as Natural Resources Canada. One of the PRAC's current thematic areas is supporting municipal adaptation planning efforts through activities such as this webinar. Today's webinar will highlight two tools being used by municipalities on the prairies to help with their adaptation planning processes. We'll hear about both of these tools, as well as from the town of Canmore and the city of Saskatoon about their experiences with the application of these tools. Our presenters today are Dustin Carey from the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. He will be presenting about FCM's Climate and Asset Management Network. Nasha Spence from the city of Saskatoon, who will be sharing Saskatoon's experiences as a member community of the Climate Asset Management Network. Richard Boyd of the All One Sky Foundation will share the All One Sky Foundation's Climate Resilient Express Toolkit. And Lori Riesling-Wynn from the town of Canmore will speak about how the town of Canmore is using the Climate Resilient Express tool during its adaptation planning process. Following the presentations, there will be an opportunity for questions. Please write your questions in the question panel at any time, and we'll answer as many of them as possible during the question and answer period at the end. So to get this webinar started, I would like to pass the mic over to Dustin Carey for his presentation at this time.
Thank you very much, Joellen, and welcome everyone. My name is Dustin Carey. I'm a Capacity Building Officer with FCM's Municipalities for Climate Innovation Program, and I'm responsible for the delivery of the Climate and Asset Management Network. So to provide a little context for the Climate Asset Management Network, or CAMN, I want you to keep two numbers in mind throughout the duration of this presentation, $141 billion and $5 billion. The former of the two represents the replacement value for municipal infrastructure in Canada in poor or very poor condition, according to the 2016 Infrastructure Report Card, while $5 billion represents the annual projected cost of climate change in Canada by 2020, according to the National Roundtable on the Environment and the Economy. And FCM's line of thinking is that by responding to the former number in the right way, Canadian municipalities can substantially mitigate the costs of the latter number. And to provide a little bit of a pictorial demonstration of this, this is an example of a road washout from rural Newfoundland earlier this year after heavy rains. It's the only highway in and out of the city, so really key transportation link. One way to look at this is it's just a piece of infrastructure that washed out during an extreme event. But another frame of thinking could be that this is a critical infrastructure asset that's not meeting its necessary levels of service. As a critical piece of infrastructure, it's going to be rebuilt and on an accelerated schedule. But if it's done so in a way to the previous design standards, one designed for a climate that may not exist anymore, then this leaves a residual vulnerability to future events of comparable or greater magnitude. by and large, our way of thinking is that the right intervention on the right asset at the right time can substantially increase municipal resilience. And at a time where there's a substantial value of infrastructure in need of replacement, this offers a real opportunity to bring those up to a standard that can increase municipal resilience to extreme events. We believe that asset management principles are the best approach to manage this response. And where asset management is currently being applied in municipalities across Canada, the integration of engineering and finance is pretty well established and understood. Where there's a need for a real mainstreaming of new lines of thinking is around the integration of resilience, energy management, land use planning, other factors like that, which can be broadly lumped under the umbrella categories of climate change adaptation and sustainability. And to really achieve these goals and push these new lines of thinking, FCM convened the Climate and Asset Management Network. This is an example of a rough template of a municipal asset management system. And as the crux of CAMN is really to change systematic thinking around infrastructure management and climate change, it was decided that it would be most effective to target high-level changes in the system structure, which could then push thinking and trickle down to those more on-the-ground, detail-oriented components of the system around specific pieces of infrastructure. So to really achieve those ends, FCM developed the following structure for CAMN. We require a collaborative approach utilizing team members from different departments within the municipal corporation, including asset management or engineering departments, finance, and sustainability or planning or corporate strategy. With those teams assembled, they're responsible for either developing or refreshing, depending on what their asset management system currently has in place, a policy, strategy, and or governance framework to inform asset management governance in a way that is consistent with the realities of changing climate. And to really facilitate this process, FCM brings the following components to the table. Cohort members are eligible for up to $52,000 to complete the scope of work above. FCM offers a collaborative space for the free exchange of ideas, questions, perspectives, successes, and failures. FCM provides or delivers a expertise provision and resources through things like a learning curriculum, templates, and case studies, training through a series of in-person workshops. And really key from my perspective is the flexibility for cohort members to undertake their project in the way that's most beneficial to them. With that structure laid out, FCM convened the network of 19 municipalities across Canada, representing every region with the exception of Quebec, and including 4 municipalities on the Prairies. And members range in size, for instance, from several in the range of 10,000 or so up to several million. So there's a real spectrum of geography, level of maturity in asset management, how far along they have gone in adaptation, and a really good diversity of members to facilitate the flow of ideas. And to benefit the members throughout this process, we've provided them a number of resources, including FCM's Climate Adaptation Maturity Scale, a self-assessment to gauge a level of maturity in climate adaptation against a set of identified and established indicators to note a baseline, track their progress over the course of their CAMN project, and provide an indication for next steps to tackle once the program is done. We gave cohort members early access to a new guidebook that was launched last week on how to develop the pillars of an asset management system and how to integrate sustainability goals into those components. This guidebook was developed in collaboration with and supported by the members of the Leaders in Asset Management Program, 17 municipalities who pioneered the approach that Cammon later built on. FCM offers the ability for to facilitate the exchange of ideas, perspectives, preferences, and learning opportunities through activities like the in-person workshops and through an online platform for resource sharing. And through a frequent series of meetings, we deliver a learning curriculum that has been determined largely by the learning preferences of the cohort members themselves. This includes topics like risk management frameworks, how to build and apply them, best practices for underground infrastructure condition assessment and how those can apply within risk management frameworks, and flood risk prioritization methods. In addition to the earlier scope of work around governance components, cohort members also had the opportunity to undertake what we called a phase 2 approach. 7 of 19 of whom did so. These are more advanced projects that similarly have to integrate those climate change components and had funding offers of up to $175,000. They can look at integrating resilience and sustainability indicators within levels of service frameworks, applying climate change as a strategic consideration within risk management frameworks across infrastructure types, and lifecycle management frameworks that can include components like a triple bottom line assessment for all new capital projects. And through this program, we hope to see the following results. An increased capacity to instill resilience in municipal infrastructure asset management across every region of Canada and within a number of municipalities of very different sizes. Best practice case study materials in asset management governance that can be utilized and spread through FCM's network for other municipalities to build upon and learn from. A network of shared connections and cross-country collaborations that cohort members can continue to draw on as they progress past the Cammon scope of work. New thinking in the fields of climate change integration and levels of service, risk management, and lifecycle management frameworks, and over $1.6 million in allocated funding so far. If you'd like to learn more about the Climate Asset Management Network or the Municipalities for Climate Innovation Program, feel free to reach out at any point. And with that overview of some of the design and intentions of the asset management program, I wanted to turn it over to Nasha Spence, the Environmental Accounting Manager with the City of Saskatoon, to provide some more details on the on-the-ground experience and project scope of one of the Cammon projects. Thank you very much.
Hi there. So I'm Nasha Spence. I'm the Environmental Accounting Manager at Saskatoon. So my job here is to create business cases for environmental work. So I'm working more predominantly on the climate change files right now. And then the other side of my work is to do some asset management work. So that includes doing evaluation of our natural capital assets in our city and also working with a team on developing our asset management framework. So the presentation I've prepared today is to discuss climate change in Saskatoon, the collaborative approach we're using to become more adaptive, and then how the Climate and Asset Management Network is supporting asset management and adaptation in Saskatoon. So this is Saskatoon here. I do want to talk a little bit about climate change here in our city and then the approach that we're using to respond to that. So Saskatoon is located along the South Saskatchewan River, and much of the riverside remains undeveloped to commercial development. So the riverbanks are under the management of the Meewasin Valley Authority, and that authority is funded jointly through the province, the municipality, and the University of Saskatchewan. We have numerous natural spaces other than the riverside here, and that includes wetlands, swales, and farmland both internal to our municipality and adjacent to. So these natural spaces are acting as a buffer to the effects of climate change. So right now we're working to incorporate the oversight of these lands into our operations, and we want to use them as effectively as we can. To give you a bit of background, we're currently a signatory with the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy and the Partners for Climate Protection. So basically this means that the city is committed to mitigating our emissions and adapting to the effects of climate change. We find that the commitments to the Covenant of Mayors and PCP are very compatible. So there's really not additional reporting requirements, and the strategies to address climate change are the same. But what we do find is one of the benefits of being members of PCP is the availability of resources and support. In terms of our approach to adaptation, it is very collaborative. So we have 4 pillars that contribute to and benefit from our corporate adaptation work. So the first is our climate and asset management work, our climate change work, natural infrastructure, and then corporate risk. So our climate and asset management program is overseen by a committee of 4, and that's 2 engineers and 2 accountants. But we're really integrating our asset management with the entire corporation. So right now we're doing internal engagement to provide feedback on our policy that we're developing, and then also to feed into our asset management strategy. We already do have some asset management plans that have been created, but all of the divisions have identified that further work is needed on the adaptation side. The climate change pillar is located in environment and corporate initiatives and addresses mitigation and adaptation. And we're using a business case approach because we find that with action plans, there's some missing features such as funding options, financial analysis, and then also things like balanced scorecards that really help with the implementation side. Oops, sorry. Then going back, we are developing a green infrastructure strategy to plan our development around natural areas. So this includes planning for natural spaces and using natural alternatives to built infrastructure. So for example, that would be using wet ponds to complement our stormwater management system. The natural asset valuation will be providing an economic value of natural assets in the city. So this will enable Saskatoon to complete a cost-benefit analysis on our development and to allocate resources appropriately and communicate the economic value that natural infrastructure provides to our municipality, particularly as an adaptive tool. And then finally, corporate risk has identified climate change as creating a risk to our corporate assets. So some risks identified by our risk register includes prolonged drought, prolonged wet weather conditions, intense rain events, flooding, freeze-thaw cycles, and so on. So climate change currently has and will continue to have an impact on our city assets. So for example, we've found that flooding events are more frequent and the stormwater system can be strained as a result. So we've identified a 3-phase approach, and we're using the same approach with our asset management framework. So again, the 2 initiatives are very closely related. So the first is forecasting the future environmental effects on assets, and that also includes financially planning for that. So we're finding that maintenance, renewal, and replacement schedules of our infrastructure in a lot of cases has to be adjusted to account for climate change. The second is taking preventative measures to minimize the risk of the environment on our assets. So for example, roadways is looking at using different types of materials on our roads to make them more resilient. And then finally, service level adjustments might need to be adjusted. Sorry, our service levels might need to be adjusted to meet the needs of our community. For example, our green spaces in the future might serve a different purpose than they do right now. So I'm thinking specifically of stormwater support for some of our park spaces. We're still pretty early in our corporate adaptation strategy, but I did want to talk about some of the work that we've done so far. So we've done a preliminary vulnerability and risk assessment. We're including climate change language in our asset management work and our other corporate initiatives so that adaptation becomes a way of doing business rather than just a project. And we did do a pilot project through a partnership with the University of Saskatchewan to test an action matrix to prioritize our adaptation action plan. And I should mention that the pilot project was completed by the Edwards School of Business. So we're using the collaborative approach outside of the corporation as well as internally. So the tool that the university created was applied to select infrastructure at the city to determine if preventative and responsive plans were in place. So I'll just show you a little bit about what that looked like. The pilot project was completed on some service areas. So for example, public works services. So the first thing they did was record climatic changes, and they went to quite a few different sources for that. And then they defined what the climate change impacts might be on the service areas. And then they did their vulnerability and risk assessment. So I'll just show you what the vulnerability assessment looks like. So basically, they did a sensitivity scale and then an adaptive capacity scale. And then that produced a score. And the highest scoring service areas were identified as being most vulnerable. And then for the risk assessment, it was based on likelihood and consequence. So consequence included things like health and safety, financial impact, and lifestyle. And then if a climate change impact was highly likely to occur and highly consequential, it got a high score and was identified as being a high-risk asset. So for the pilot project itself, the highest risk events for the sections that were identified were increased fire events in the community and flooding events within our municipality. And it was pretty clear that city operations would be strained in certain services like public works for their responses and emergency response services. So the next steps are to expand the pilot project to all city infrastructure and services to identify which assets and services are most at risk. So we're hoping that within the next 18 months or so, we would have our corporate adaptation strategy ready to publish and to start to implement. So in terms of the support that we've received through the Climate and Asset Management Network, we have been involved with the network since the fall. So the Climate and Asset Management Committee in Saskatoon right now is developing our policy and strategy and our governance framework. And I will say that even just going through the development process has already moved the dial on how we're involving adaptation in our asset management framework. So we can already see some of those results. Some of the benefits we found with joining the Climate and Asset Management Network is the training, and that's both in person and through webinars, and some really good networking opportunities with municipalities across the country. One thing that's pretty clear is that no one municipality is doing it exactly right, but all municipalities have some things that are really working for them that we've kind of written down and want to apply to our municipality as well. There's some really innovative strategies that are happening. A couple of key features our committee has found especially useful is the PCP Hub. And this slide just shows a piece of what the Hub does offer. So there's upcoming events and webinars that are advertised here. It has some resources available. There's a platform for discussion that we've used with other municipalities. So it's just a platform that we can maybe create partnerships or use best practices or things like that. And then also, besides supportive funding for joining the Climate and Asset Management Network, FCM has also supported 2 of our committee members to take in an asset management certificate. So it's a really good course. We're in week 4, in the middle of week 4 right now. And we've already been able to start applying the tools that we've been learning in that course. So that's all I had today. I will say that if you want to contact the City of Saskatoon for inquiries into our work, I would really encourage you to do so. If you are looking for contact information, I would recommend going to the city website. We're a pretty friendly group over here, and we're happy to share or receive any tips that you might have.
Great. Thank you, Dustin and Nasha. In a moment, we will be turning our attention to the development and application of the Climate Resilience Express tool. But first, just a reminder that you can write your questions for the presenters in the questions panel at any time during this webinar. And we will be answering them during the question and answer period at the end of the presentations. And with that, I'd therefore like to ask Richard if he could speak about the Climate Resilient Express tool.
Hi, Joellen, thank you. I'm going to provide a brief overview of the Climate Resilience Express or CRE tool that we developed here in Alberta to basically kickstart adaptation within smaller municipalities. I want to start with a little bit of background on the tool itself. In 2014, we ran a series of municipal workshops across Alberta, basically to try and raise awareness of climate-related impacts and adaptation actions to address those impacts. Sort of an educational series of workshops. They were attended by about 100 representatives from various municipalities from across the province. And some of the main messages that we got from the workshops were, yes, we are concerned about weather-related and climate-related extremes and climate change and how that's impacting our communities. We have a desire to act, but we really, we're limited in the resources that we have, and so we're looking for something that's relatively simple, quick, for us to implement that would get us some immediate results that were robust enough to take forward. They were also looking for some forms of financial support and also expertise to try and move forward with any form of adaptation planning exercise. And one of the other messages that we were receiving was that there was in some communities there was a need to sort of develop and build some sort of business case in order to justify to senior management or council that we really should be devoting some sort of time and resources to climate adaptation planning. So those were the messages that we received from these workshops. And in response to that, we crafted this Climate Resilience Express planning tool. And the tool itself is really it's based around a very streamlined, what we call express adaptation planning process, which is centered around a one-day workshop. And in order to provide sort of ongoing support, we developed what we call an action kit. And this action kit contains all of the resources, materials, and information required to run the workshops, including all of the slide decks and all of the supporting information and materials. And that essentially makes it pretty cost effective to work with new communities who are using the tool, because all of the information and the agendas, etc., is already available. And then also, as part of the action kit itself, we developed a unit providing guidance on how to build a business case for senior management within the municipality that would create the case for devoting some time and resources to adaptation planning. Now I just want to look at the actual adaptation process that's embedded within the CRE, and it's based around sort of 4 very broad tasks. The sort of first task is really about defining the context for the planning exercise. And of course, this is done in advance of the workshop. And it's really about, if necessary, building the case to proceed with the planning exercise. And another key aspect of the setting the context is really about defining the scope. And the scope tends to be either looking solely at the corporation of the municipality and impacts upon the corporation, assets and services. And also part of the scope could be looking at the sort of impacts across the wider community, so the economy, the natural environment, public health and safety. And most of the communities we've been working at have adopted this sort of community-wide scope. And then based on the sort of scope definition as well, we that sort of dictates the the types of stakeholders and who you want in the room for the workshop, because the whole process is basically stakeholder driven. And then also the final sort of main task about preparing for the workshop is about compiling relevant climate information for the locality. And so those things are done in advance of the workshop. And then the workshop itself really comprises 2 analytical tasks, which are about the sort of risk and opportunity assessment and the formulation of actions to address priorities. And that is, like I was saying, that's completely stakeholder driven. And then post-workshop, the sort of final task is preparing what we call a climate resilience action plan for the municipality, which is essentially left with them to take forward. So that's the sort of embedded planning process within the tool. And I just want to look at the workshop itself and highlight the sort of flow of the workshop, which is divided into 5 sessions. And this is all done over the course of one day. The first session is really a sort of plenary discussion with participants about the community's past and current experience with weather and climate and extreme events. And that's essentially done to sort of provide context for the sessions that follow in the workshop, and also to ground any future scenarios for the community and in the past and current experience of the community, which we've found is actually quite important. Then the workshop proceeds on to sort of second session, and that second session is basically a presentation of historical climate trends and projected climate futures for the community, and also associated with those climate projections. There are projections with changes in the natural environment as well. Part of the session is also about building awareness of some basic climate concepts that are really needed for the participants to fully appreciate some of the climate information that's being provided. And then once the climate projections are provided for the community through the presentation, we then move on into an exercise where we divide the participants up into small groups. That's within session 3 there. And within the small groups, they're instructed to brainstorm around the impacts and consequences for projected changes for the community. And we usually consider about 6 or 8 specific projected changes in temperature, precipitation, storminess, growing season, for example. And so they work with those projected changes and brainstorm around what are some of the impacts for the community and what are the consequences for the economy, consequences for infrastructure and services, consequences for public health and safety, and consequences for infrastructure and services. Then once they've done that sort of brainstorming exercise, we run a series of exercises where they look at trying to basically establish priority risks associated with those impacts. And that's done in 2 stages. There's an individual scoring exercise where they use scales that are provided to basically try and rate the consequences on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being negligible and 5 being extreme. And then from that, they also look at using scales to establish the likelihood of those consequences occurring as well within the community. And then based on that, we look to try and identify around 4 to 6 sort of priority risks or opportunities for the community, which are then taken forward into the sort of next session 5, the action planning. And that session 5 is really, again, we divide them up into small groups based on their expertise and assign them a specific priority risk or opportunity. And then they're again given a set of instructions that they work around to develop and coarsely characterize a set of actions to address the priority risks or opportunities. So that's the sort of workshop process that they work through. And then Just wanted to highlight some of the main outcomes from the workshop that are presented within the action plans. And this is just, examples from, I believe it's Mackenzie County, the action plan for Mackenzie County. And on the left-hand side, there is like one of the main outputs, which is the risk rating matrix, or a risk heat map, sometimes it's called. And that is generated at the workshop, and it's used as a means, the main means for prioritizing risks, with impacts in the upper right-hand corner with relatively high consequences and a relatively high likelihood of occurring, representing priority concerns for the community. And those are the ones that we tend to work within the action planning exercise. I should say we look at both risks and opportunities associated with climate change, and so a similar matrix is produced also for opportunities facing the community. On the right-hand side is just an example of the sort of what we call these starter action plans that are developed at the workshop. And this is just starter action plans for two of the priority risks identified in Mackenzie County. And these really just contain a sort of high-level description of an action, provide some information to try and frame the possible cost for implementation, along with the time frame and the lead group or organization that would be responsible for implementation. As you might be able to see there, although the text is fairly small, they're defined at a fairly coarse level, and most of these will require some sort of further development before they can proceed to implementation. And the action kit itself does provide some advice on how to do that. Just looking at where the kit's been utilized over the last few years, we've worked with about 13 communities now across Alberta, and developed climate resilience action plans for these communities. In the most part, like with the exception of the Duke, the process usually works like we obtain funding from various sources, and then we issue an expression of interest through the Municipal Climate Change Action Centre for communities basically to participate and work through the process which we support. And the support tends to be in terms of like we help prep for the workshops in terms of gathering the relevant information, setting up the scope and the relevant stakeholders that would be attending, and then also facilitate the workshops and then afterwards draft the plan in a template that we already have. And just for example, like last year, we obtained funding from the Municipal Climate Change Action Centre to take 7 communities through the process. And those are the plans that you see there or the covers of the plans on the right-hand side of the slide there. So those 7 communities just completed the process last fall. As I was saying, these plans are left with the communities to take forward themselves. And while the kit does provide advice on implementation, it's not something that we have really actively supported to date. Like I was saying, the plans are typically left with the community. They are usually approved by council, and some of the communities then basically during the annual budget cycles, they basically pick actions that fit with their priorities at the time, and then take those forward to implementation. But it is a sort of recognized gap in the toolkit at the moment. And basically in response to that, we've recently put together a project and received funding from the FCM and a series of partner communities, which are underscored there in red, to work on a project that's focused solely on implementing some of the actions to address priority risks. And that project we're referring to as the Climate Resilience Exchange. The goal of that project is to define, select, and implement 4 actions in a coordinated fashion across the partner communities to address regional priority risks, not just individual community priority risks, but regional risks. And the idea, rationale behind that is that if we work in a coordinated fashion across the capital region, that should allow us to take advantage of economies of scale and also avoid any sort of maladaptations or adaptations that actually produce negative externalities. And another key part of that project, given that the tidal exchange, is a lot of peer-to-peer learning and mentorship from other communities across Canada and North America that have also tried to address successfully some of the same priority regional risks. And that's really all I had to say in terms of an overview of the action kit. I should say that it is available from both the All One Sky website, the full kit, and also from the Municipal Climate Change Action Centre website. So I just want to hand over now to Laurie Risling-Wynn from the town of Canmore to talk about their adaptation planning process and experience and use of the CRE.
Thanks so much, Richard. And thanks, Joellen and PRAC, for the opportunity to share this information with you all this afternoon. Again, my name is Laurie Risling-Wynn. I'm a Sustainability Coordinator and Development Planner for the town of Canmore. And I'm going to share with you the work that we did with All One Sky Foundation to create our adaptation and resilience plan. So as with a number of municipalities in 2013, it was a wild year for us here in Canmore. We experienced catastrophic flooding of 7 mountain creeks around the community. The Trans-Canada Highway was closed for 7 days, the CP rail line. We had 1,200 evacuation orders issued over a 2-week period and a boil water advisory in place for 14 days. And while we can't definitively say that this was a climate change related weather event, it was certainly an example of an extreme weather event that we were inadequately prepared for. So just some photos of what the community looked like at that time. So with that in mind, Canmore knew that flooding was just one climate related risk that the community was facing. And so we wanted to initiate a process to dive into the, what are our additional risks and do some active planning around addressing that. So we began a collaboration with All One Sky in 2015. It took about 10 months to work through this process, and then we presented to our council in 2016. So the intent being to build resilience, to proactively adapt and protect our residents. And I think Dustin mentioned as well with his Newfoundland example that, you spend $1 on adaptation and it typically saves you $4 in sort of reactionary spending. So it's fiscally prudent to do this work as well. So I'm just going to touch briefly on the process that we engaged with All One Sky, and Richard's just done a great summary of the process and the workshopping, but here's what it looked like for Canmore specifically. Of course, we identified our scope and our stakeholders, and it was really it's kind of a blend of a corporate plan and a community plan. We did a deep dive on the corporate side on the action planning, but in identifying our risks and opportunities, we took a bit of a broader look and did include community stakeholders. And we got our climate and weather projections to 2050, which was incredibly useful. We moved into, again, identifying risks and opportunities, and then taking those key high priority and medium priority risks and opportunities, developing some actions and the action plan around that, and then developing the plan, ultimately having council approve it, and then moving forward with implementation. So I do want to point out that we actually have 2 interrelated plans. We have an environmental sustainability action plan that is really focused on mitigation, so our efforts to reduce our GHGs. And then the climate adaptation and resilience plan is focused on adaptation. So how do we need to adjust the work that we're doing related to program services and infrastructure that will adapt to a changing climate. So we did get climate projections to 2050, which again was super valuable. That exercise hadn't been done specifically for the Bow Valley in the past. So it was great to see that. And essentially what it means for us is that things are going to be warmer, wetter, and wilder. So we have an increase of 1.9 degrees in annual mean temperature, an increase of 5% of annual precipitation, but a decrease in summer precipitation. And then, of course, all of the impacts related to ecosystems and other things like the extent of glaciers and whatnot. So just to put that temperature increase into perspective, this is our 2050 climate projections put on a bell curve of the 20th century climate in the Bow Valley. So what we knew from past data, and then we fitted it to a bell curve. And you can see in the middle of the bell curve that this was our mean annual temperature for the 20th century. And then we project that 1.9 degree increase on the right-hand side of the bell curve. So what it really means is that the mean annual temperature in the 2050s in the Bow Valley will be similar to the warmest 2% of the 20th century. So that's a really significant shift in order of magnitude, and it really does have a number of cascading impacts on our glaciers, on regional ecosystems, on things like stream flow and stream temperatures increasing when we're expecting to see peak stream flows versus what exists today, what happens with respect to our annual snowpack and looking at a decline of up to 50%. And then this piece about wildfires. So we'll have a warmer and drier climate in the 2050s, of course, creating more favorable conditions for wildfires, and then an extension of that wildfire season. So, we're looking at all of those climate parameters and not just how they're going to impact the infrastructure of the town of Canmore, but also the surrounding environment and regional ecosystem. So it was a pretty broad look at what's going to happen. So as Richard mentioned, after we did the climate modeling, we looked at risks and opportunities. 22 risks and opportunities were identified, and again, using that framework of likelihood and consequence. So no big surprise for us. We knew that forest fire was one of our highest priority risks, followed by flooding of the Bow River. And in terms of medium priority risks, things like creek flooding, stormwater flooding, water supply shortage, so drought, heavy snowfall events, extreme wind, and changes to our freeze-thaw cycles that impact things such as roads and bridges. So once we'd identified those risks and opportunities, we took the high and medium priority of them and developed actions. And so 51 actions were identified to help us increase our resiliency and build capacity. So this is just an example of one of the action planning frameworks that was developed for forest fire specifically. So again, as Richard mentioned, the action is identified, the sort of relative implementation cost, and then the time frame. So practically speaking, we're looking at things like updating our fire smart mitigation strategy, hosting additional emergency preparedness campaigns, hiring a full-time municipal emergency plan coordinator. So again, as Richard mentioned, it gives a relative sort of cost estimate, but obviously we need to do additional work to sort of define this and bring it forward to council if it would result in an operation or a capital impact on our budgets. Here's another example just in terms of what we'd be looking at to try and adapt to flooding of the Bow River. So then, of course, like with any good plan, you want to move forward and implement it. And so for us, we've already identified and started to work on a number of things in the action plan. And again, some can be implemented quickly with minimal investment, whereas others are going to require additional conditioning and budget, maybe even external funding. So these projects would be brought back to council for further approval. And the report and plan certainly are a standalone document, but climate resilience, we're looking at ways to integrate it into the work that we're due through that mainstreaming and considering the climate change risks and actions into our strategic plans and decisions related to design and maintenance of upgrading municipal infrastructure and facilities, and looking at future land use and development decisions as well. So it's important to note that this climate resilience action planning is a dynamic process, and the plan will need to be periodically updated and ensuring that it remains relevant to the community and continues to reflect the goals of Canmore and its community. And of course, we'll be providing implementation updates to Council as we move forward year over year. And I just wanted to finish with a little anecdote I attended FCM Sustainable Communities Conference back in February, and I sat with a colleague from the city of Windsor, and she mentioned to me that, over the last several years, Windsor has had 2 1-in-100-year floods. They've had 2 tornadoes. They've had multiple cases of confirmed West Nile virus, and they also had a mosquito larva test positive for Zika. And so, these sort of climate change impacts that have been identified, we thought we would have to face at some point in the future, but often what we're seeing happening is that what we thought was going to be, many years out and coming is actually happening now. So we need to get busy doing this work and preparing our communities for this uncertainty in the future. And it's going to look different for all of us, but using a process like All One Sky's Climate Resilience Express model, I think is a way that we can start getting this work done.
Okay. Great. Thank you very much, Richard and Lori, as well as Dustin and Nasha, for the informative presentations you just given about ways in which we can be supporting adaptation planning, either through the Climate and Asset Management Network or through the use of the Climate Resilience Express tool. At this point in time, we are going to be moving into the question and answer period of the webinar. So if you have any questions, please type them in the questions panel, and we'll try to answer as many as we can in the remaining 10 minutes of this webinar. There already have been a couple of questions submitted, and therefore I will begin by raising a question regarding the adaptation planning in Saskatoon. So Nasha, one of the questions that has been asked is whether or not Saskatoon is already begun to adjust its municipal built infrastructure engineering design standards to make them more flood damage resilient.
Hi, yeah, that's a really good question. I will say that there have been many conversations about that. And we continue to have the conversations about it. There are a lot of implications with, as you probably know, with changing building standards. But what I will say is one of the benefits of having our collaborative approach is that it enables all of the divisions to get together and talk about those implications before we move ahead with adopting any change in regulations or policy or anything like that. So I would imagine that over the next 12 to 18 months, we'll have a lot of resolution on any number of those initiatives that we are talking about, so that we do make sure that we've engage the business community and make sure that there aren't any, skeletons in the closet that we don't necessarily know about, some implications with their businesses, and B, to make sure that we have our ducks in a row on the municipal side, so that if we do make any adjustments to policy or regulation or bylaw, that we've got the resources in place that we can respond to issues rather than have more issues after the fact.
Thank you. As more, I guess, a bit more of a follow-up question. The question has been raised regarding what actions you might be taking specifically in relation to wastewater disposal, and whether or not Saskatoon already has, if you have a combined wastewater disposal system, are there any plans to separate them as part of your potential adaptation actions?
Another good question. Being one of the accountants on the committee, I don't feel qualified to answer that question, which is one of the benefits of having a couple of engineers on our committee as well. So yeah, I don't know the answer to that, but if there were some inquiries that anybody was wanting from Saskatoon, I really would encourage you to reach out to us, and we could make sure that the person who can answer the question would be present.
Okay, great, thank you. A second question that has been raised is for Richard. Would you be able to speak to the source of the methodologies that you used to develop the Climate Resilient Express tool and to inform any of the adaptation strategies that you've described?
Yeah, hopefully. The tool itself is based on a review of all of the existing guidance that's out there at the moment. I mean, there's tens and tens of guidance documents on how to do municipal adaptation planning. And we just reviewed those tools, and bearing in mind, the sort of desire to have this as a sort of very super streamlined process. That was only going to require basically participants at a workshop for one day. We just looked and reviewed the existing guidance and then adapted the best aspects of that would work within a one-day environment. And that's essentially the background to the actual process in terms of its, the methodology and the actual climate science information that we use to support the workshops. We have some climate scientists that we work with that are based in British Columbia, and they use the PKIC tool set to generate the sort of downscale projections and information for the municipalities that we work in. I don't know if that answers the question regarding the methods. And could you repeat the second part of the question, please?
Whether or not there's anything more that you can say that was done just to inform the development of the adaptation strategies.
Not really. It's entirely based around the one day workshop, and really about having the appropriate people in the room that cover the various sort of aspects of the community, like someone who can talk to the economy, someone who can talk about infrastructure and services, someone who can talk about the nature, or expertise in the natural environment, someone with expertise in public health and safety. And if you can get, the right group of people in the room, that's really what's driving the information that's ultimately put within the action plans. And again, it's just based on that process that I outlined in the slide, that sort of 5 sessions at the workshop, and having some really focused activities that they work through to generate basically the risk and opportunity matrix and the starter action plans.
Yeah. That actually leads into another question that was asked, was to gain more information about the stakeholder engagement process. So either, Richard, you've provided a general overview of how that process goes, but perhaps Lori, you could speak specifically to how it is you went about sort of selecting the stakeholders to be invited to the workshop, and any lessons that you learned through that process.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we wanted to make sure that we had representatives internally from a number of our departments. So that included engineering, public works, emergency services, myself from planning. So, we tried to keep it to a manageable number. So that's something that communities will want to think about is, what capacity is the room and the capacity of your own staff to attend a full day workshop. So, but we did want to have, key internal stakeholders at the table. And then in terms of looking at who to invite from the community, we tried to identify, broadly those economic drivers. So our business and development organizations, so they represent builders and developers in the community. So we thought that they were really important. We invited someone from the healthcare sector, some not-for-profit NGOs were invited to come and participate as well. So, we did a bit of a stakeholder mapping exercise ahead of time to try and identify who we wanted in the room. And again, I guess in terms of lessons learned, it's difficult to have everybody participate, but as much as possible, we tried to engage people before, during, and after, through email if they couldn't attend, and give them draft versions of the report when it was available and allow them to provide comment. So, I think we do the best that we can to try and get people to participate on the day, but if that's not possible, then we look for other ways that we can solicit their input afterwards.
Okay. Thank you. We have no time actually left in this webinar, but there's a couple more questions. So if people don't mind holding on for another 5 minutes, I'll just raise what hopefully will be a couple of quick questions. One is, Richard, is it the examples that you've given so far about the Climate Resilience Express tool have largely been in relation to smaller communities? Do you think that the Climate Resilience Express tool could be applied to larger cities, be that Saskatoon or Winnipeg or Regina?
I mean, in theory, it could be, but we haven't to date. I think the largest communities we've worked in are Leduc and Spruce Grove, with populations of around 30,000. But there tends to be, like, the work that we've done with the city of Edmonton, it's much more involved and way more detailed, because they've got different demands and resource capacities than the smaller communities. So short answer, yes, in theory it could be, but whether or not it's going to generate sufficient level of detail, I'm not, I don't know. And it's also worth pointing out that the application within Canmore, it was a more detailed application at the CRE than the one we've been using in other communities. And it wasn't just solely the one-day workshop. We did extra add-ons and more engagement with the stakeholder groups than just through the one day.
Great. I have one final question actually for Nasha, and that's in relation to the work you were saying about the natural infrastructure and assessing the economic value of it in order to do cost-benefit analysis of as you take over more management of the natural spaces around Saskatoon. Would you be able to speak at all into how it is you've been doing that, the economic valuation of the natural infrastructure?
Yeah, sure. So basically what we're working on, and the project is called the Natural Capital Asset Valuation Project. So what we're doing is we're looking at natural infrastructure that falls within the city of Saskatoon boundary, and we're applying a really similar I guess, valuation framework that you would find with tangible capital assets. So for example, if you're valuing a building, that building is made up of certain component parts. So it might be the foundation and the walls, the windows, the drywall, the lighting, whatever. And so we're applying that same principle to our natural infrastructure as well. So it does look a little bit different because with tangible capital assets, it's really easy to say, okay, well, this is our book value, or this is what we've paid for that asset, or this is what we expect to sell that asset as, or whatever. But with natural infrastructure, you don't have those parameters. And so there's a number of I guess, there's a bunch of data that feeds into that, and we're developing the framework right now. We are working with CPA Canada as well, because I would like the valuation to be relevant. So CPA Canada does know the methodology at a high level that we're trying to create here. And it is a little bit different than other municipalities, because other municipalities would maybe value their natural infrastructure by defining the replacement cost if that natural space was built. So I would encourage you to stay tuned. It's a really interesting project, and it will really go a long way, especially to allocating resources appropriately for our operations.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm afraid that there are a couple more questions, but we will need to wrap up the webinar at this time. So I'd like to thank everyone for attending, and especially to thank today's presenters, Dustin Carey, Nasha Spence, Richard Boyd, and Lori Riesling-Wynn. I would like to let you know we have recorded today's webinar, and we'll be posting it along with the presentations from today on the PRAC website. And there is a short evaluation survey at the end of this webinar, which we'd very much appreciate if you could fill out for us. And we'll also be sharing the survey in a follow-up email. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much, everyone, for joining this PRAC webinar, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day.